Fiji, Fiji Hindi. Officially the Republic of Fiji, Fiji Hindi, Fiji Ga. Aragia, is an island country in Melanesia, part of Oceania in the South Pacific Ocean about northeast of New Zealand's North Island. Its closest neighbours are Vanuatu to the west, New Caledonia to the southwest, New Zealand's Kermadec Islands to the southeast, Tonga to the east, the Samoas and Francis Wallis and Futuna to the northeast, and Tuvalu to the north. Fiji consists of an archipelago of more than 330 islands, of which 110 are permanently inhabited, and more than 500 islets, amounting to a total land area of about. The most outlying island is Ono Islaw. The two major islands, Viti Levu and Vanua Levu, account for 87% of the total population of the capital. Suva, on Viti Levu, serves as the country's principal cruise ship port. About 3/4 of Fijians live on Viti Levu's coasts, either in Suva or in smaller urban centres such as Nadi, where tourism is the major local industry. The majority of Fiji's islands formed through volcanic activity starting around 150 million years ago. Some geothermal activity still occurs today on the islands of Vanua Levu and Taveuni. The geothermal systems on Viti Levu are non-volcanic in origin, with low-temperature c. 35 to 60 degrees Celsius surface discharges. Sabita Hot Springs near Nadi is a good example. Humans have lived in Fiji since the 2nd millennium BC, first Austronesians and later Melanesians, with some Polynesian influences. Europeans visited Fiji from the 17th century onwards, and, after a brief period as an independent kingdom, the British established the colony of Fiji in 1874. Fiji operated as a crown colony until 1970, when it gained independence as the Dominion of Fiji. A military government declared a republic in 1987 following a series of coups d'état. In a coup in 2006, Commodore Frank Bainimarama seized power. When the High Court ruled the military leadership unlawful in 2009, President Ratu Josefu Iloilo, whom the military had retained as the nominal head of state, formally abrogated the 1997 constitution and reappointed Bainimarama as interim prime minister. Later in 2009, Ratu Eplineilatikau succeeded Iloilo as president. After years of delays, a democratic election took place on the 17th of September 2014. Bainimarama's Fiji First Party won 59.2% of the vote, and international observers deemed the election credible. Fiji has one of the most developed economies in the Pacific thanks to its abundant forest, mineral, and fish resources. Its currency is the Fijian dollar, and its main sources of foreign exchange are its tourist industry, remittances from Fijians working, and bottled water exports.
Etymology.
Fiji's main island is known as Viti Levu, and it is from this that the name Fiji is derived, though the common English pronunciation is based on that of their island neighbours in Tonga. Its emergence can be described as follows. Fijians first impressed themselves on European consciousness through the writings of the members of the expeditions of Cook who met them in Tonga. They were described as formidable warriors and ferocious cannibals, builders of the finest vessels in the Pacific, but not great sailors. They inspired awe amongst the Tongans, and all their manufactures, especially bark cloth and clubs, were highly valued and much in demand. They called their home Viti, but the Tongans called it Fisi, and it was by this foreign pronunciation, Fiji, first promulgated by Captain James Cook, that these islands are now known. Fiji, the anglicised spelling of the Tongan pronunciation, was used in accounts and other writings until the late 19th century, by missionaries and other travellers visiting Fiji.
History. Early settlement and development of Fijian culture.
Located in the central Pacific Ocean, Fiji's geography has made it both a destination and a crossroads for migrations for many centuries. According to oral tradition, the indigenous Fijians of today are descendants of the chieflet Unazobosobo and those who arrived with him on the Cornitoni canoe. Landing at what is now Vuda, the settlers moved inland to the Nakorvadra Mountains. Though this oral tradition has not been independently substantiated, The Fijian government officially promotes it, and many tribes today claim to be descended from the children of Lachuna Zobasoba. Pottery art from Fijian towns shows that Fiji was settled by Austronesian peoples before or around 3500 to 1000 BC, with Melanesians following around 1000 years later. Although the question of Pacific migration still lingers, it is believed that the Lapita people or the ancestors of the Polynesians settled the islands first, but not much is known of what became of them after the Melanesians arrived. They may have had some influence on the new culture, and archaeological evidence shows that they would have then moved on to Samoa, Tonga and even Hawaii. Archaeological evidence shows signs of settlement on Mochiriki Island from 600 BC and possibly as far back as 900 BC. Aspects of Fijian culture are similar to the Melanesian culture of the Western Pacific but have a stronger connection to the older Polynesian cultures. Trade between Fiji and neighboring archipelagos long before European contact is testified by the canoes made from native Fijian trees found in Tonga and Tongan words being part of the language of the Law group of islands. Pots made in Fiji have been found in Samoa and even the Marquesas Islands. In the 10th century, the Tuitonga Empire was established in Tonga, and Fiji came within its sphere of influence. The Tongan influence brought Polynesian customs and language into Fiji. The empire began to decline in the 13th century. Across from east to west, Fiji has been a nation of many languages. Fiji's history was one of settlement but also of mobility, and over the centuries, a unique Fijian culture developed. Large elegant watercraft with rigged sails called drua were constructed in Fiji, some being exported to Tonga. Distinctive village architecture evolved consisting of communal and individual bure and vale housing with an advanced system of randpants and moats usually being constructed around the more important settlements. Pigs were domesticated for food and a variety of agricultural plantations such as bananas existed from an early stage. Villages would also be supplied with water brought in by constructed wooden aqueducts. Fijians lived in societies that were led by chiefs, elders and notable warriors. Spiritual leaders, often called bit, were also important cultural figures, and the production and consumption of yakona was part of their ceremonial and community rites. Fijians developed a monetary system where the polished teeth of the sperm whale, called tambua, became an active currency. A type of writing also existed which can be seen today in various petroglyphs around the islands. They also produced a refined Masi cloth textile industry, with the material being used to make sails and clothes such as the malo and the liku. As with most other human civilizations, warfare was an important part of everyday life. In pre-colonial Fiji, the Fijians were noted for their use of weapons, especially war clubs. Fijians use many different types of clubs that can be broadly divided into two groups. The two main types of clubs they used were two-handed clubs and small specialized throwing clubs called ala. With the arrival of Europeans and colonialism in the late 1700s, many elements of Fijian culture were either repressed or modified to ensure European, namely British, control. This was especially the case concerning traditional Fijian spiritual beliefs. Early colonists and missionaries utilized and conflated the concept of cannibalism in Fiji to give a moral imperative for colonial intrusion. By labeling native Fijian customs as debased and primitive, they were able to promote a narrative that Fiji was a paradise wasted on savage cannibals. Extravagant stories made during the 19th century, such as that regarding Ratu Udaruudara, who is said to have consumed 872 people and to have made a pile of stones to record his achievement, permitted an enduring racial typecast of the uncivilized Fijian. Cannibalism, as an impression, was an effective racial tool deployed by the colonists that has endured through the 1900s and into the modern day. Authors such as Derek Scar, for example, have perpetuated 19th-century claims of freshly killed corpses piled up for eating and ceremonial mass human sacrifice on the construction of new houses and boats. Although Fiji was known as the Cannibal Isles, other more recent research doubts even the existence of cannibalism in Fiji. This view is not without criticism, and perhaps the most accurate account of cannibalism in 19th-century Fiji may come from William MacGregor, the long-term chief medical officer in British colonial Fiji. During the Little War of 1876, he stated that the rare occasion of tasting of the flesh of the enemy was done to indicate supreme hatred and not out of relish for a gastronomic treat. Recent archaeological research conducted on Fijian sites has begun to shed light on the accuracy of some of these European accounts of cannibalism. Studies conducted by scholars including De Gusta, Cochrane, and Jones provide evidence that cannibalism has been practiced in Fiji through skeletal modifications such as those due to burning or cutting. In the Jones 2015 study, isotopic analysis of bone collagen provided evidence that human flesh had been consumed by Fijians, although it was likely a small and not necessarily regular part of the diet. James Cook, the British navigator, visited one of the southern Law Islands in 1774. It was not until 1789, however, that the islands were charted and plotted, when William Bligh, the castaway captain of passed Ovlau and sailed between the main islands of Viti Levu and Vanua Levu en route to Batavia, in what is now Indonesia. Bligh Water, the strait between the two main islands, is named after him, and for a time, the Fiji Islands were known as the Bligh Islands. The first Europeans to maintain substantial contact with the Fijians were sandalwood merchants, whalers and Bush de Mercy cucumber traders. The first whaling vessel known to have visited was the Yarn and Hope in 1799, and she was followed by many others in the 19th century. These ships came for drinking water, food and firewood and, later, for men to help man their ships. Some of the Europeans who came to Fiji in this period were accepted by the locals and were allowed to stay as residents. Probably the most famous of these was a Swede by the name of Carl Svensson, better known as Charlie Savage. Charlie was permitted to take wives and establish himself in a high rank in Boer society in exchange for helping defeat local adversaries. In 1813, however, Charlie became a victim of this lifestyle and was killed in a botched raid. By the 1820s, Levuka was established as the first European-style town in Fiji, on the island of Ovlau. The market for Bush de Mer in China was lucrative, and British and American merchants set up processing stations on various islands. Local Fijians were utilized to collect, prepare and pack the product, which would then be shipped to Asia. A good cargo would result in a half-yearly profit of around $25,000 for the dealer. The Fijian workers were often given firearms and ammunition as an exchange for their labor, and by the end of the 1820s most of the Fijian chiefs had muskets and many were skilled at using them. Some Fijian chiefs soon felt confident enough with their new weapons to forcibly obtain more destructive weaponry from the Europeans. In 1834, men from Viwa and Boer were able to take control of the French ship L'Amiable Josephine and use its cannon against their enemies on the Riwa River, although they later ran it aground. Christian missionaries like David Cargill also arrived in the 1830s from recently converted regions such as Tonga and Tahiti, and by 1840 the European settlement at Levuka had grown to about 40 houses, with former whaler, David Whippy, being a notable resident. The religious conversion of the Fijians was a gradual process which was observed firsthand by Captain Charles Wilkes of the United States Exploring Expedition. Wilkes wrote that all the chiefs seemed to look upon Christianity as a change in which they had much to lose and little to gain. Christianized Fijians, in addition to forsaking their spiritual beliefs, were pressured into cutting their hair short, adopting the Sulu form of dress from Tonga and fundamentally changing their marriage and funeral traditions. This process of enforced cultural change was called Latu. Intensification of conflict between the cultures increased, and Wilkes was also involved in organizing a large punitive expedition against the people of Malolo. He ordered an attack with rockets which acted as makeshift incendiary devices. The village, with the occupants trapped inside, quickly became an inferno, with Wilkes himself noting that the shouts of men were intermingled with the cries and shrieks of the women and children as they burned to death. Wilkes demanded the survivors should sue for mercy, and if not they must expect to be exterminated. Around 57 to 87 Malolo and people were killed in this encounter.
Cakobau and the wars against Christian infiltration.
The 1840s was a time of conflict where various Fiji clans attempted to assert dominance over each other. Eventually, a warlord by the name of Sir Epinezer Cakobau of Boer Island was able to become a powerful influence in the region. His father was Ratatano of Isawaka, the Vuniva chiefly title meaning warlord, often translated also as paramount chief, who had previously defeated the much larger Burabay Saga Confederacy and succeeded in subduing much of western Fiji. Cakobau, following on from his father, became so dominant that he was able to expel the Europeans from Levuka for 5 years over a dispute about their giving of weapons to his local enemies. In the early 1850s, Cakobau went one step further and decided to declare war on all Christians. His plans were thwarted after the missionaries in Fiji received support from the already converted Tongans and the presence of a British warship. The Tongan Prince Senel Mafu, a Christian, had established himself on the island of Lakeba in the Law Archipelago in 1848, forcibly converting the local people to the Methodist Church. Cakobau and other chiefs in the west of Fiji regarded Mafu as a threat to their power and resisted his attempts to expand Tonga's dominion. Cakobau's influence, however, began to wane, and his heavy imposition of taxes on other Fijian chiefs, who saw him at best as first among equals, caused them to defect from him. Around this time the United States also became interested in asserting their power in the region, and they threatened intervention following a number of incidents involving their consul in the Fiji Islands, John Brown Williams. In 1849, Williams had his trading store looted following an accidental fire, caused by stray cannon fire during a 4th of July celebration. And in 1853 the European settlement of Levuka was burnt to the ground. Williams blamed Cakobau for both these incidents, and the U.S. representative wanted Cakobau's capital at Bor destroyed in retaliation. A naval blockade was instead set up around the island, which put further pressure on Cakobau to give up on his warfare against the foreigners and their Christian allies. Finally, on April 30, 1854, Cakobau offered his service application and yielded to these forces. He underwent the litu and converted to Christianity. The traditional Fijian temples in Bor were destroyed and the sacred no-con-no-go trees were cut down. Cakobau and his remaining men were then compelled to join with the Tongans, backed by the Americans and British, to subjugate the remaining chiefs in the region who still refused to convert. These chiefs were soon defeated, with Karanikio of the Rewa being poisoned and Ratumara of Kaba being hanged in 1855. After these wars, most regions of Fiji, except for the interior highland areas, had been forced into giving up much of their traditional systems and were now vassals of Western interest. Cakobau was retained as a largely symbolic representative of the Fijian people and was allowed to take the ironic title of Tuiviti King of Fiji, but the overarching control now lay with foreign powers.
Cotton, Confederacies and the Kaikolo.
The rising price of cotton in the wake of the American Civil War 1861 to 1865 saw a flood of hundreds of settlers come to Fiji in the 1860s from Australia and the United States in order to obtain land and grow cotton. Since there was still a lack of functioning government in Fiji, these planters were often able to get the land in violent or fraudulent ways, such as exchanging weapons or alcohol with Fijians who may or may not have been the true owners. Although this made for cheap land acquisition, competing land claims between the planters became problematic with no unified government to resolve the disputes. In 1865, the settlers proposed a confederacy of the 7 main native kingdoms in Fiji to establish some sort of government. This was initially successful and Cakobau was elected as the first president of the Confederacy. With the demand for land high, the white planters started to push into the hilly interior of Viti Levu, the largest island in the archipelago. This put them into direct confrontation with the Kaikolo, which was a general term to describe the various Fijian clans resident to these inland districts. The Kaikolo were still living a mostly traditional lifestyle. They were not Christianized and they were not under the rule of Cakobau or the Confederacy. In 1867, a traveling missionary named Thomas Baker was killed by Cakobau in the mountains at the headwaters of the Tuka River. The acting British consul, John Bates Thurston, demanded that Cakobau lead a force of Fijians from coastal areas to suppress the Colorado. Cakobau eventually led a campaign into the mountains but suffered a humiliating loss, with 61 of his fighters being killed. Settlers also came into conflict with the local eastern Cakobau people called the Wainamala. John Bates Thurston called in the Australia Station section of the Royal Navy for assistance. The Navy duly sent Commander Ole Lambert and to conduct a punitive mission against the Wainamala. An armed force of 87 men shelled and burnt the village of Dioku, and a skirmish ensued which resulted in the deaths of over 40 Wainamala.
Kingdom of Fiji 1871 to 1874.
After the collapse of the Confederacy, Mafu established a stable administration in the Law Islands, and the Tongans, therefore, were again becoming influential. Other foreign powers such as the United States were also considering the possibility of annexing Fiji. This situation was not appealing to many settlers, almost all of whom were British subjects from Australia. Britain, however, still refused to annex the country, and subsequently a compromise was needed. In June 1871, George Austin Woods, an ex-lieutenant of the Royal Navy, managed to influence Cakobau and organize a group of like-minded settlers and chiefs into forming a governing administration. Cakobau was declared the monarch tuiviti and the Kingdom of Fiji was established. Most Fijian chiefs agreed to participate, and even Mafu chose to recognize Cakobau and participate in the constitutional monarchy. However, many of the settlers had come from British colonies like Victoria and New South Wales, where negotiation with the indigenous people almost universally involved the barrel of a gun. As a result, several aggressive, racially motivated opposition groups, such as the British Subjects Mutual Protection Society, sprouted up. One group called themselves the Ku Klux Klan in a homage to the white supremacist group in America. However, when respected individuals such as Charles St. Julian, Robert Sherson Swanston and John Bates Thurston were appointed by Cakobau, a degree of authority was established. With the rapid increase in white settlers into the country, the desire for land acquisition also intensified. Once again, conflict with the Cakobau in the interior of Viti Levu ensued. In 1871, the killing of two settlers named Spires and McIntosh near the Bar River, Fiji in the northwest of the island prompted a large punitive expedition of white farmers, imported slave laborers and coastal Fijians to be organized. This group of around 400 armed vigilantes, including veterans of the U.S. Civil War, had a battle with the Cakobau near the village of Cuba, in which both sides had to withdraw. The village was destroyed, and the Cakobau, despite being armed with muskets, received numerous casualties. The Cakobau responded by making frequent raids on the settlements of the whites and Christian Fijians throughout the district of Bar. Likewise, in the east of the island on the upper reaches of the Rewa River, villages were burnt and a great many Cakobau were shot by the vigilante settler squad called the Rewa Rifles. Although the Cakobau government did not approve of the settlers taking justice into their own hands, it did want the Cakobau subjugated and their land sold off. The solution was to form an army. Robert S. Swanston, the Minister for Native Affairs in the kingdom, organized the training and arming of suitable Fijian volunteers and prisoners to become soldiers in what was invariably called the King's Troops or the Native Regiment. In a similar system to the native police that was present in the colonies of Australia, two white settlers, James Harding and W. Fitzgerald, were appointed as the head officers of this paramilitary brigade. The formation of this force did not sit well with many of the white plantation owners, as they did not trust an army of Fijians to protect their interests. The situation intensified further in early 1873 when the Burns family were killed by a Cakobau raid in the Bar River area. The Cakobau government deployed 50 King's troopers to the region under the command of Major Fitzgerald to restore order. The local whites, with their own large force under the leadership of Mr. White and Mr. de Courcy Island, refused their posting, and a further deployment of another 50 troops under Captain Harding was sent to emphasize the government's authority. To prove the worth of the native regiment, this augmented force went into the interior and massacred about 170 Cakobau people at Nakoro. Upon returning to the coast, the force were met by the white settlers who still saw the government troops as a threat. A skirmish between the government's troops and the white settlers brigade was only prevented by the timely intervention of Captain William Cox Chapman, who promptly detained Mr. White and Mr. de Courcy Island, forcing the group to disband. The authority of the king's troops and the Cakobau government to crush the Cakobau was now total. From March to October 1873, a force of about 200 king's troops under the general administration of R.S. Swanston, with around 1,000 coastal Fijian and white volunteer auxiliaries, led a campaign throughout the highlands of Viti Levu to annihilate the Colorado. Major Fitzgerald and Major H.C. Thurston, the brother of John Bates Thurston, led a two-pronged attack throughout the region. The combined forces of the different clans of the Cakobau made a stand at the village of Nakuli. The Cakobau were defeated, with dynamite and fire being used to flush them out from their defensive positions amongst the mountain caves. Many Cakobau were killed, and one of the main leaders of the hill clans, Ratadradra, was forced to surrender, with around 2,000 men, women and children being taken prisoner and sent to the coast. In the months after this defeat, the only main resistance was from the clans around the village of Nibutotor. Major H.C. Thurston crushed this resistance in the 2 months following the battle at Nakuli. Villages were burned, Cakobau were killed, and a further large number of prisoners were taken. The operations were now over. About 1,000 of the prisoners, men, women and children, were sent to Levuka, where some were hanged, the rest being sold into slavery and forced to work on various plantations throughout the islands.
Blackbirding and slavery in Fiji.
The blackbirding era began in Fiji in 1865, when the first New Hebridean and Solomon Island laborers were transported there to work on cotton plantations. The American Civil War had cut off the supply of cotton to the international market when the Union blockaded southern ports. Cotton cultivation was potentially an extremely profitable business. Thousands of European planters flocked to Fiji to establish plantations, but found the natives unwilling to adapt to their plans. They sought labor from the Melanesian islands. On the 5th of July 1865, Ben Pease received the first license to provide 40 laborers from the New Hebrides to Fiji. The British and Queensland governments tried to regulate this recruiting and transport of labor. Melanesian laborers were to be recruited for a term of 3 years, paid £3 per year, issued with basic clothing, and given access to the company store for supplies. Most Melanesians were recruited by deceit, usually being enticed aboard ships with gifts, and then locked up. The living and working conditions for them in Fiji were worse than those suffered by the later Indian indentured laborers. In 1875, the chief medical officer in Fiji, Sir William McGregor, listed a mortality rate of 540 out of every 1,000 laborers. After the expiry of the 3-year contract, the government required captains to transport the laborers back to their villages, but most ship captains dropped them off at the first island they sighted off the Fiji waters. The British sent warships to enforce the law, Pacific Islanders Protection Act of 1872, but only a small proportion of the culprits were prosecuted. A notorious incident of the blackbirding trade was the 1871 voyage of the brig Carl, organized by Dr. James Patrick Murray, to recruit laborers to work in the plantations of Fiji. Murray had his men reverse their collars and carry black books, so to appear to be church missionaries. When islanders were enticed to a religious service, Murray and his men would produce guns and force the islanders onto boats. During the voyage, Murray shot about 60 islanders. He was never brought to trial for his actions, as he was given immunity in return for giving evidence against his crew members. In addition to the blackbirded labor from other Pacific islands, thousands of people indigenous to the Fijian archipelago were also sold into slavery on the plantations. As the white settler-backed Cakobau government, and later the British colonial government, subjugated areas in Fiji under its power, The resultant prisoners of war were regularly sold at auction to the planters. This not only provided a source of revenue for the government, but also dispersed the rebels to different, often isolated islands where the plantations were located. The land that was occupied by these people before they became slaves was then also sold off for additional revenue. An example of this is the Lovoni people of Ovlau Island, who after being defeated in a war with the Cakobau government in 1871, were rounded up and sold off to the settlers at £6 per head. 2,000 Lovoni men, women and children were sold, and their period of slavery lasted 5 years. Likewise, after the Cakobau Wars in 1873, thousands of people from the hill tribes of Viti Levu were sent to Levuka and sold into slavery. Warnings from the Royal Navy stationed in the area that buying these people was illegal were largely given without enforcement, and the British consul in Fiji, Edward Bernard Marsh, regularly turned a blind eye to this type of labor trade.
Colonization.
Despite achieving military victories over the Cakobau, the Cakobau government was faced with problems of legitimacy and economic viability. Indigenous Fijians and white settlers refused to pay taxes, and the cotton price had collapsed. With these major issues in mind, John Bates Thurston approached the British government, at Cakobau's request, with another offer to cede the islands. The newly elected Tory British government under Benjamin Disraeli encouraged expansion of the empire and was therefore much more sympathetic to annexing Fiji than it had been previously. The murder of Bishop John Coleridge Bateson of the Melanesian mission at New Kapu in the Reef Islands had provoked public outrage, which was compounded by the massacre by crew members of more than 150 Fijians on board the brig Carl. 2 British commissioners were sent to Fiji to investigate the possibility of an annexation. The question was complicated by maneuverings for power between Cakobau and his old rival, Mafu, with both men vacillating for many months. On the 21st of March 1874, Cakobau made a final offer, which the British accepted. On 23 September, Sir Hercules Robinson, soon to be appointed the British governor of Fiji, arrived on HMS Dido and received Cakobau with a royal 21-gun salute. After some vacillation, Cakobau agreed to renounce his Tuiviti title, retaining the title of Vunivo, or Protector. The formal session took place on the 10th of October 1874, when Cakobau, Mafu, and some of the senior chiefs of Fiji signed 2 copies of the deed of cession. Thus the colony of Fiji was founded. 96 years of British rule followed.
Measles epidemic of 1875.
To celebrate the annexation of Fiji, Hercules Robinson, who was governor of New South Wales at the time, took Cakobau and his 2 sons to Sydney. There was a measles outbreak in that city, and the 3 Fijians all came down with the disease. On returning to Fiji, the colonial administrators decided not to quarantine the ship that the convalescents travelled in. This was despite the British having a very extensive knowledge of the devastating effect of infectious disease on an unexposed population. In 1875–76, an epidemic of measles resultant of this decision killed over 40,000 Fijians, about 1/3 of the Fijian population. Some Fijians who survived were of the opinion that this failure of quarantine was a deliberate action to introduce the disease into the country. Whether this is the case or not, the decision, which was one of the first acts of British control in Fiji, was at the very least grossly negligent.
Sir Arthur Gordon and the Little War.
Sir Hercules Robinson was replaced as governor of Fiji in June 1875 by Sir Arthur Hamilton Gordon. Gordon was immediately faced with an insurgency of the Kalamarian Cakobau people. In early 1875, colonial administrator Edgar Leopold had met with thousands of Highland clans at Navuso in Viti Levu to formalize their subjugation to British rule and the Christian religion. Laird and his delegation managed to spread the measles epidemic to the Highlanders, causing mass deaths in this population. As a result, anger at the British colonists flared throughout the region, and a widespread uprising quickly took hold. Villages along the Sigatoka River and in the highlands above this area refused British control, and Gordon was tasked with quashing this rebellion. In what Gordon himself termed the Little War, The suppression of this uprising took the form of two coordinated military campaigns in the western half of Viti Levu. The first was conducted by Gordon's second cousin, Arthur John Lewis Gordon, against the Calamari insurgents along the Sigatoka River. The second campaign was led by Louis Nellis against the Kaikalo in the mountains to the north of the river. Governor Gordon invoked a type of martial law in the area where A.J. L. Gordon and Nellis had absolute power to conduct their missions outside of any restrictions of legislation. The two groups of rebels were kept isolated from each other by a force led by Walter Carew and George LaHunty, who was stationed at Nasakoko. Carew also ensured the rebellion did not spread east by securing the loyalty of the Wainamala people of the Eastern Highlands. The war involved the use of the soldiers of the old native regiment of Cakobau, supported by around 1,500 Christian Fijian volunteers from other areas of Viti Levu. The colonial government of New Zealand provided most of the advanced weapons for the army, including 100 Snider rifles. The campaign along the Sigatoka River was conducted under a scorched earth policy whereby numerous rebel villages were burnt and their fields ransacked. After the capture and destruction of the main fortified towns of Korovachuma, Bukushia and Matanavatu, the Calamari surrendered en masse. Those who weren't killed in the fighting were taken prisoner and sent to the coastal town of Kuvu. This included 827 men, women and children, as well as the leader of the insurgents, a man named Mudu. The women and children were distributed to places like Nadi and Nadroga. Of the men, 15 were sentenced to death at a hastily conducted trial at Sigatoka. Governor Gordon was present, but chose to leave the judicial responsibility to his relative, A.J. L. Gordon. 4 were hanged and 10, including Mudu, were shot, with one prisoner managing to escape. By the end of proceedings, the governor noted that my feet were literally stained with the blood that I had shed. The northern campaign against the Kaikalo in the highlands was similar but involved removing the rebels from large, well-protected caves in the region. Nellis managed to clear the caves after some considerable time and large expenditure of ammunition. The occupants of these caves included whole communities, and as a result many men, women and children were either killed or wounded in these operations. The rest were taken prisoner and sent to the towns on the northern coast. The chief medical officer in British Fiji, William McGregor, also took part both in killing Kaikalo and tending to their wounded. After the caves were taken, the Kaikalo surrendered and their leader, Bisiki, was captured. Various trials were held, mostly at Nasakoko under LaHunty, and 32 men were either hanged or shot, including Bisiki, who was killed trying to escape. By the end of October 1876, the little war was over and Gordon had succeeded in vanquishing the rebels in the interior of Viti Levu. Those insurgents who weren't killed or executed were sent into exile with hard labor for up to 10 years. Some non-combatants were allowed to return to rebuild their villages, but many areas in the highlands were ordered by Gordon to remain depopulated and in ruins. Gordon also constructed a military fortress, Fort Carnarvon, at the headwaters of the Sigatoka River, where a large contingent of soldiers were based to maintain British control. He renamed the native regiment, the Armed Native Constabulary, to lessen its appearance of being a military force.
Indian indenture system in Fiji.
Gordon decided in 1878 to import indentured laborers from India to work on the sugarcane fields that had taken the place of the cotton plantations. The 463 Indians arrived on the 14th of May 1879, the first of some 61,000 that were to come before the scheme ended in 1916. The plan involved bringing the Indian workers to Fiji on a 5-year contract, after which they could return to India at their own expense. If they chose to renew their contract for a second 5-year term, they would be given the option of returning to India at the government's expense, or remaining in Fiji. The great majority chose to stay. The Queensland Act, which regulated indentured labour in Queensland, was made law in Fiji also. Between 1879 and 1916, tens of thousands of Indians moved to Fiji to work as indentured labourers, especially on sugarcane plantations. A total of 42 ships made 87 voyages, carrying Indian indentured laborers to Fiji. Initially the ships brought laborers from Calcutta, but from 1903 all ships except two also brought laborers from Madras and Bombay. A total of 60,965 passengers left India, but only 60,553 including berths at sea arrived in Fiji. A total of 45,439 boarded ships in Calcutta and 15,114 in Madras. Sailing ships took, on average, 73 days for the trip while steamers took 30 days. The shipping companies associated with the labour trade were Ernst Line and British India Steam Navigation Company. Repatriation of indentured Indians from Fiji began on 3 May 1892, when the British Peer brought 464 repatriated Indians to Calcutta. Various ships made similar journeys to Calcutta and Madras, concluding with Sir's 1951 voyage. In 1955 and 1956, 3 ships brought Indian labourers from Fiji to Sydney, from where the labourers flew to Bombay. Indentured Indians wishing to return to India were given 2 options. One was travel at their own expense and the other free of charge but subject to certain conditions. To obtain free passage back to India, labourers had to have been above age 12 upon arrival, completed at least 5 years of service and lived in Fiji for a total of 10 consecutive years. A child born to these labourers in Fiji could accompany his or her parents or guardian back to India if he or she was under 12. Due to the high cost of returning at their own expense, most indentured immigrants returning to India left Fiji around 10 to 12 years after arrival. Indeed, just over 12 years passed between the voyage of the first ship carrying indentured Indians to Fiji, the Leonidas, in 1879, and the first ship to take Indians back, the British Peer, in 1892. Given the steady influx of ships carrying indentured Indians to Fiji up until 1916, repatriated Indians generally boarded these same ships on their return voyage. The total number of repatriates under the Fiji indenture system is recorded as 39,261, while the number of arrivals is said to have been 60,553. Because the return figure includes children born in Fiji, many of the indentured Indians never returned to India. Direct return voyages by ship ceased after 1951. Instead, arrangements were made for flights from Sydney to Bombay, the first of which departed in July 1955. Labourers still travelled to Sydney by ship.
The Tuka rebellions.
With almost all aspects of indigenous Fijian social life being controlled by British authorities, a number of charismatic individuals preaching dissent and return to pre-colonial culture were able to forge a following amongst the disenfranchised. These movements were called Tuka, which roughly translates as those who stand up. The first Tuka movement was led by Ndungu Moy, better known as Navosavakandu, which means he who speaks only once. He told his followers that if they returned to traditional ways and worshipped traditional deities such as Tijai and Rokala, their current condition would be transformed, with the whites and their puppet Fijian chiefs being subservient to them. Navosavakandu was previously exiled from the Viti Levu Highlands in 1878 for disturbing the peace, and the British quickly arrested him and his followers after this open display of rebellion. He was again exiled, this time to Rotuma, where he died soon after his 10-year sentence ended. Other Tuka organizations, however, soon appeared. The British were ruthless in their suppression of both the leaders and followers, with figureheads such as Sailos being banished to an asylum for 12 years. In 1891, entire populations of villages who were sympathetic to the Tuka ideology were deported as punishment. 3 years later, in the highlands of Vanuatu, where locals had re-engaged in traditional religion, the governor of Fiji, John Bates Thurston, ordered in the armed native constabulary to destroy the towns and the religious relics. Leaders were jailed and villagers exiled or forced to amalgamate into government-run communities. Later, in 1914, Apollo Sinawai came to the forefront of Fijian Tuka resistance by founding a cooperative company that would legally monopolize the agricultural sector and boycott European planters. The company was called the Vitikabani and it was a hugely successful. The British and their proxy council of chiefs were not able to prevent the Vitikabani's rise, and again the colonists were forced to send in the armed native constabulary. Apollosi and his followers were arrested in 1915 and the company collapsed in 1917. Over the next 30 years, Apollosi was rearrested, jailed and exiled, with the British viewing him as a threat right up to his death in 1946.
Fiji in World War II.
Fiji was only peripherally involved in World War I. One memorable incident occurred in September 1917 when Count Felix von Luckner arrived at Wakaya Island, off the eastern coast of Viti Levu, after his raider had run aground in the Cook Islands following the shelling of Papeete in the French territory of Tahiti. On 21 September, the district police inspector took a number of Fijians to Wakaya, and von Luckner, not realizing that they were unarmed, unwittingly surrendered. Citing unwillingness to exploit the Fijian people, the colonial authorities did not permit Fijians to enlist. One Fijian of chiefly rank, a great-grandson of Cakobau's, did join the French Foreign Legion, however, and received France's highest military decoration, the Croix-de-Guerre. After going on to complete a law degree at Oxford University, this same chief returned to Fiji in 1921 as both a war hero and the country's first ever university graduate. In the years that followed, Ratu Searle Alasakuna, as he was later known, established himself as the most powerful chief in Fiji and forged embryonic institutions for what would later become the modern Fijian nation. By the time of World War II, the United Kingdom had reversed its policy of not enlisting natives, and many thousands of Fijians volunteered for the Fiji Infantry Regiment, which was under the command of Ratu Sir Edward Cakobau, another great-grandson of Sir Ebenezer Cakobau. The regiment was attached to New Zealand and Australian Army units during the war. Because of its central location, Fiji was selected as a training base for the Allies. An airstrip was built at Nadi later to become an international airport, and gun emplacements studded the coast. Fijians gained a reputation for bravery in the Solomon Islands campaign, with one war correspondent describing their ambush tactics as death with velvet gloves. Corporal Safanias Sukanevo, of Jakarta, was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross as a result of his bravery in the Battle of Bougainville.
Responsible government.
A constitutional conference was held in London in July 1965, to discuss constitutional changes with a view to introducing responsible government. Indo-Fijians, led by A.D. Patel, demanded the immediate introduction of full self-government, with a fully elected legislature, to be elected by universal suffrage on a common voters' roll. These demands